The speakers crackled to life. A voice filled the studio. Johnny Carson's own voice. From 20 years ago. And he froze. It was March 1983. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. Another Tuesday night in Studio 6B. Another monologue. Another 300 people in the audience expecting the perfectly orchestrated dance of comedy and conversation that Johnny had mastered over 21 years of hosting. Johnny was in the middle of a joke about Ronald Reagan's latest press conference. The audience was laughing. Ed McMahon was doing his signature chuckle from his seat beside the desk. The cameras were rolling smoothly. Everything was exactly as it should be. And then the audio system glitched. A crackling sound. Like an old radio being tuned. Then a voice, young, uncertain, scratchy with the quality of early 1960s recording equipment, echoed through the studio speakers. "My name is Johnny Carson, and I promise you this. If I ever get the chance to make people laugh for a living, I'll never forget the people who can't afford to laugh." Johnny stopped mid-sentence. The joke about Reagan died on his lips. His face went pale. His hands, which had been gesturing animatedly, slowly lowered to rest flat on his desk, as if he needed to steady himself. The audience fell silent, confused. Ed McMahon's chuckle faded. The band members looked at each other uncertainly. Carson stopped mid-monologue. The entire studio froze. In the control room, director Bobby Quinn was frantically pressing buttons. "What the hell is that? Where's that audio coming from? Cut it! Cut it now!" Technical director Mike Sinella was scrambling through the control board. "I don't know. It's not on our feed. It's coming from somewhere in the building." The voice continued crackling through the speakers with the haunting quality of something long buried. "I'm broadcasting from WOW Radio in Omaha, Nebraska, and I'm nobody right now. But if I ever become somebody, I want to use that to help people who are invisible. The ones nobody pays attention to." Johnny Carson sat completely motionless behind his desk, staring at nothing, his jaw clenched, his eyes beginning to glisten. Ed McMahon leaned over, his voice low but caught by the desk microphone. "Johnny? You okay, Pally?" Johnny didn't respond. He was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere 21 years in the past. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1962. Johnny Carson wasn't always the undisputed king of late-night television. In 1962, he was a 36-year-old comedian and game show host trying to convince NBC executives that he could take over The Tonight Show from Jack Paar. He was talented, sharp, funny, but untested in that particular arena. The network was skeptical. During the negotiations, during the endless meetings and screen tests and anxious waiting, Johnny made a trip back to Omaha. Back to WOW Radio, where he'd started broadcasting in his early 20s, where he'd learned the fundamentals of connecting with an audience through nothing but his voice. The station manager, Harold Mitchell, was still there. The man who'd given Johnny his first real break in broadcasting, who'd believed in him when he was just a nervous kid with big dreams and no experience. Harold was dying. Lung cancer. The doctors had given him 6 months. Johnny visited him at the hospital on a cold February afternoon. Harold was thin, his voice weak, but his eyes still had that sharp intelligence that had recognized Johnny's potential all those years ago. "You're going to get that Tonight Show job," Harold said, his voice raspy. "I can feel it. You're going to be the biggest thing in television." "You don't know that," Johnny said, uncomfortable with the certainty in Harold's voice. "I do. But I need you to promise me something. Anything." Harold gripped Johnny's hand with surprising strength. "When you get famous, and you will, don't become one of those people who forgets where they came from. Don't become someone who only cares about ratings and money and rubbing elbows with movie stars." "I won't," Johnny promised. "I mean it, kid. Use whatever platform you get to help people. The invisible ones. The ones who need someone to notice them. Can you promise me that?" Johnny promised. Of course he promised. Harold Mitchell was dying. You promise dying men whatever they ask. Before Johnny left Omaha, Harold asked him to record something at the WOW studio. Just your voice, Harold explained. Saying what you believe in. What you promise to stand for if you make it big. I want to keep it. To remind myself that the kid I hired still exists somewhere inside whoever you become. Johnny thought it was a strange request, but he did it. Sat in the same booth where he'd broadcast countless morning shows years earlier, put on the headphones, and spoke into the microphone about his promises and his hopes. He forgot about that recording the moment he left the studio. 2 months later, Harold Mitchell died. Johnny was already in New York by then, already host of The Tonight Show, already on his way to becoming a household name. He sent flowers to the funeral. He wrote a letter to Harold's widow. And then, like most young men building careers, he moved on. 21 years passed. 21 years of monologues and celebrity interviews and becoming exactly what Harold had believed he would become. The biggest thing in television. The king of late night. Johnny Carson, American institution. And somewhere in Omaha, in Harold Mitchell's widow's attic, sat a reel-to-reel tape of a young Johnny Carson making promises to a dying man. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. The recording continued playing in Studio 6B. Johnny's young voice, preserved on magnetic tape for over 2 decades, now filling the space where his older, more famous voice usually commanded attention. Harold, you asked me what kind of broadcaster I want to be if I get this Tonight Show job. I want to be the kind who remembers that there are people out there who are struggling, who are lonely, who turn on the television at night because it's the only company they have. I want to make them laugh, sure, but I also want to make them feel seen. Ed McMahon had tears in his eyes now, understanding what was happening even if he didn't know the full story. The audience sat in reverent silence, sensing they were witnessing something far beyond entertainment. In the control room, producer Fred DeCordova had stopped shouting. He stood behind Bobby Quinn, watching the monitors, his hand over his mouth. Don't cut it, Fred said quietly. Let it play. The recording crackled one more time. So I promise you, Harold, if I ever forget why I'm doing this, if I ever become someone who's just going through the motions for a paycheck, I give you permission to haunt me. Remind me. Make me remember. Then silence. Just the soft hiss of dead air on an old recording. Johnny Carson sat at his desk, both hands pressed flat against the wooden surface, his shoulders shaking slightly. Crying. Quietly, but unmistakably crying on live television. Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. Johnny reached into his desk drawer, the same drawer where he kept his emergency cue cards, his backup pens, his reading glasses. He pulled out a small photograph, worn at the edges from being handled over the years. The photograph showed a young man, barely recognizable as Johnny Carson, standing in a radio booth with an older gentleman in a cardigan. Both were smiling. The older man had his arm around the young broadcaster's shoulders. Johnny held the photograph toward camera 1, his hand trembling slightly. This is Harold Mitchell, Johnny said, his voice thick with emotion, barely controlled. He gave me my first radio job in 1951. He died in 1962, right before I started hosting this show. And I forgot about him. The studio was absolutely silent. Doc Severinsen had quietly signaled the band to lower their instruments. Even the camera operators seemed to move more carefully, more respectfully. I don't know how that recording got played tonight, Johnny continued. I don't know who found it or how it ended up in our system. But I just heard my own voice making promises to a dying man 21 years ago. And I need to ask myself right now, in front of all of you, whether I kept those promises. He paused, looking at the photograph, at the image of his younger self with the man who believed in him. Did I become someone who only cares about ratings and movie star guests? Did I forget the invisible people? Did I stop seeing the audience as real human beings and start seeing them as numbers? Ed McMahon started to speak, probably to reassure Johnny, To tell him of course he'd kept his promises, but Johnny held up one hand. "Let me answer honestly," Johnny said. "Some nights, yes. Some nights I've gone through the motions. Some nights I've been tired or frustrated or so focused on the show running smoothly that I forgot why I'm really here." He looked directly into the camera, speaking to the millions watching at home. "But hearing that recording, hearing that kid in Omaha making those promises, I think maybe Harold is haunting me. Just like I gave him permission to do. Reminding me. But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming." Johnny stood up from his desk. Not the casual standing he did sometimes during interviews. This was deliberate, purposeful. He walked out from behind the desk and addressed the studio audience directly. "How many of you," he said, his voice steady now, stronger, "came to this taping tonight because you needed to laugh? Because things at home are hard, or you're going through something difficult, or you just needed to forget your problems for an hour?" Slowly, hands began to rise throughout the audience. 10 hands. 20. 50. More than half the studio audience raised their hands. Johnny nodded, his eyes scanning the faces. "That's why I'm really here. Not for the ratings. Not for the celebrity interviews. For you. For the people who need an hour of escape. Who need to feel less alone." He gestured back toward his desk. "That kid on that recording understood something I've let myself forget sometimes. That this." He gestured around the studio, at the cameras and lights and all the machinery of television production. "All of this is only meaningful if it connects with real human beings who need it." The audience began to applaud. Softly at first, then building. Not the wild applause of entertainment, but something deeper. Recognition. Gratitude. Johnny held up his hand for quiet. "I want to do something tonight. Something I've never done before in 21 years of hosting this show." He looked at his producer in the wings. Fred de Cordova was shaking his head frantically, knowing whatever Johnny was about to do wasn't in the script, wasn't planned, would throw off the entire schedule. Johnny ignored him. "If you're watching at home right now," Johnny said, looking directly into camera 1, "and you're alone, and you're struggling with something, grief, illness, loneliness, fear, I want you to know something. You're not invisible. You're the reason this show exists. You're who Harold Mitchell wanted me to remember." He paused, his voice breaking slightly. "So this is me remembering. This is me keeping the promise I made to a dying man in 1962. You matter. Every single one of you watching right now matters." The studio audience rose as one. Standing ovation. But it wasn't for Johnny. It was with him. For the moment. For the honesty. For the reminder that television could be more than just entertainment. Ed McMahon was openly crying now, not even trying to hide it. Doc Severinsen had his trumpet lowered, his eyes red. Everyone in that studio understood they were witnessing something that transcended television. Johnny returned to his desk, still holding Harold's photograph. He placed it carefully beside his coffee mug, where it would remain visible for the rest of the show. "We're going to continue with tonight's program," Johnny said, composing himself. "But that photograph stays right here. Where I can see it. Where I remember." The show went on. Interviews happened. Jokes were told. But everything felt different. More real. More human. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. After the taping, Johnny had the photograph framed and mounted on the wall behind his desk. It stayed there until his final show in 1992. When asked about it by guests, he'd simply say, "That's Harold. He keeps me honest." The recording was never explained. No one ever determined how it ended up in the studio's audio system that night. Some staff members whispered it was impossible, that tape had been in Omaha. Others said maybe impossible things happen when they need to. Johnny never forgot again. In his final monologue in 1992, his last words were, "Thank you for letting me into your homes. Harold, I kept my promise. The photograph and the recording now sit together in the Smithsonian. A reminder that even legends need to be haunted sometimes.